Our principal speaker this afternoon is ideally suited to help us to look back to understand the meaning of the Jesuit assassinations and to look forward to the significance of human rights in the very different world that we live in today. Ambassador Robert White, who will address us, has been deeply involved in human rights issues for many years. He holds his master's degree from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. He has his bachelor's degree from St. Michael's College and was a Fulbright scholar in England. He also served for many years in the diplomatic sphere as a Foreign Service career officer. He specialized in Latin American affairs. Early in this service as a Foreign Service diplomat, he served in Hong Kong. He was part of the U.S. delegation to the United Nations, in Honduras, and in Ecuador. Among the other posts that he has held is that of Latin American Director of the Peace Corps, Deputy Chief of Mission to Colombia and Nicaragua, Deputy Permanent Representative to the Organization of American States, Ambassador to Paraguay, and most particularly relevant for our subject tonight, United States Ambassador to El Salvador in the time just preceding that at which the Jesuits were assassinated. In 1977 and 78, he served as the President's Special Representative to the Inter-American Conference on Education, Science, and Culture. Since retiring from his diplomatic career and in foreign service in 1981, he served as a senior associate for the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and he is currently the president of the Center for International Policy. So we welcome Ambassador Robert White to speak to us this afternoon on human rights in an age of terror, the Jesuit assassinations remembered and the future envisioned. Ambassador White.
It's a long way from Central America to the Middle East. Yet those who wonder how our nation could unilaterally attack Iraq, a country that posed no threat to the United States, would do well to study our military intervention in El Salvador. In his wonderful book, A Very Thin Line, Theodore Draper wrote that if the story of our intervention in Central America is not fully known and understood, a similar usurpation of power by a small, strategically placed group within the United States government may well occur before we are prepared to recognize what is happening. Prophetic words. There are, of course, great differences between El Salvador and Iraq, but there are also striking parallels. In both cases, a small group of civilians at odds with mainstream policy thinking inflated and distorted a manageable challenge to the level of a national security crisis. In both cases, we responded to the problem militarily, even when the other party requested negotiations. In both cases, we defied our allies, the United Nations, and international law. And in both cases, our intervention provoked massive protests around the world. Cast your minds back to 1980 and Ronald Reagan's defeat of President Jimmy Carter. Before taking office, President Reagan and his foreign policy advisors had already staked out El Salvador as the first foreign policy claim in El Salvador. They chose this small Central American country primarily for demonstration purposes. A quick, decisive crushing of the Salvadoran insurgents was to serve as a contrast with the Carter administration, which had worked patiently to fashion a policy that would do four things: avoid a left-wing military victory, moderate the barbarity of the Salvadoran security forces, protect the human rights of the Salvadoran people, and encourage both sides towards a political solution. Contemptuous of these diplomatic efforts, then Secretary of State Alexander Haig declared, "Mr. President, this is one you can win." I tried to, when I spoke to him, I tried to tell him that the Salvadoran military were great at shooting unarmed people, but they were not very good at shooting the people who fired back, and that it might take it a lot longer than he thought to achieve victory. And he was basically unimpressed with my remarks, and thought that this would be a matter of months. But it took more than a decade. 75,000 murdered Salvadorans and 1 million Salvadoran refugees to the United States to prise the Reagan and then the Bush administrations loose from this delusion. Before the Reagan White House could begin the massive military buildup of the Salvadoran security forces, it had one important hurdle to overcome. Only the month before, sisters Ida Clark, Maura Ford, Dorothy Kazel, and Miss Jean Donovan were murdered. President Carter had immediately suspended assistance to El Salvador until the government demonstrated good faith efforts to solve this terrible crime. I was ambassador to El Salvador at that moment, and the reports of my embassy had made it clear that the murders of these American citizens was the work of the Salvadoran security forces, who after violation and torture had executed the women at point-blank range. There was no doubt that this would happen. I went to the gravesite, well, before, as they were pulling the bodies out of the ground. The day after the Reagan administration took office, I received a telephone call from a high official saying that Secretary of State Haig required a telegram from me stating that the Salvadoran government was making progress in solving the murders. Here I'm not talking about some kind of shading of truth or not telling the entire truth in order to give a policy a time to work. Here I'm talking about an outright lie, and not but to my own government. Now, this recall, I was reading just recently a great book called Present at the Creation by former Secretary of State Dean Acheson. And Acheson was asked once where he had found the courage to resign from the Treasury Department and the public service he loved, rather than continue to work for a policy he regarded as disastrous. And Acheson replied, "Oh, I had no choice. It was a matter of national interest as well as personal honor. I might have gotten away shirking one, but never both." weighing the almost certain consequences and talking over with my wife, I decided I had no choice. I sent in a telegram stating, "It is amazing to me that the Department of State can announce publicly that the investigation of the nuns' deaths is proceeding satisfactorily. This is not backed up by any reports from this embassy. I reiterate, for the record, that in my judgment there is no sign of any sincere attempt to locate and punish those responsible for this atrocity." And that is how I became the first ambassador fired by the Reagan administration, and how I happened to leave the Foreign Service. Now, this is important not because of my personal faith, but because Haig's request constituted an attack on the integrity of an important government institution, the Foreign Service. If Foreign Service officers do not tell the truth to their own government, then we are in deep, deep trouble. And I have to tell you that the example of my firing had consequences. From that time on, too much of Foreign Service reporting from Central America was tailored to policy considerations and ignored the facts on the ground. This enabled the Reagan administration to partially succeed in creating a fictionalized version of reality in El Salvador, in which massacres by the military were covered up and human rights violations by the revolutionaries exaggerated. Something similar is happening today. The Bush administration tried to influence analysts at the CIA, and now they have put on over in charge of the CIA a overtly political appointee, and the turmoil that is raging inside the agency is something that the government really can't afford at this juncture. Now, returning to El Salvador 9 years later, it took 9 years later, the war is still at a standstill. A tie, if anything, the momentum is with the revolution. More than 2/3 of Salvadorans now favor ending the war by negotiation. The Bush administration, however, adamantly refuses and repeats the tired slogan of Elliott Abrams that the revolutionaries could not be permitted to shoot their way to power. This, of course, is what revolutionaries do, and in what indeed they finally accomplished. Then, in the early morning of November 16, 1989, a detachment of Salvadoran soldiers from the American-trained Atlacat Battalion entered the premises of the University of Central America, the Jesuit University, and forced 6 Jesuit priest professors to lie on the ground. They searched the grounds, found a housekeeper and her daughter, and killed them all with rifle shots to the head. I knew all of these men, and in particular, I was a friend of Segundo Montes. And I recall their heroism, their devotion to the people of El Salvador, and to the cause of peace and justice. Despite the overwhelming evidence, the Department of State claimed that the murders of the Jesuits could have been the work of the left, of the revolution. Our ambassador, knowing this statement to be false, still followed the State Department line. To anyone even vaguely acquainted with the geography of San Salvador, this claim was absurd. This area where the Jesuit University was located was also, in effect, the redoubt of the Salvadoran note. The night of the murders, there were over 300 Salvadoran army officers, enlisted men, and others made it humanly impossible for the revolutionaries to infiltrate the grounds, and hundreds witnessed the Abacat battalion takeover of the university, saw and heard the firing of missiles and the rifle shots. Now, it was common knowledge all over the world that the Salvadoran military had spread a reign of terror over the land. The civilian leaders of the Democratic Revolutionary Front, well, starting off with Archbishop Romero, then the civilian leaders of the Democratic Revolutionary Front, two government ministers, American land reform technicians, the churchwomen, and the Jesuits. Yet the Reagan administration could still refer to the revolutionaries as terrorists. And the Secretary of State announced that our unstinting support for the military of El Salvador meant that, quote, counterterrorism would take the place of human rights as a priority in U.S. foreign policy. Now, it's worth noting that a United Nations study some years later, entitled From Madness into Hope, found that 85% of the human rights violations were committed by the Salvadoran military. Now, with the murder of the Jesuits, the Congress cut off funds. A large percentage of the Congress were graduates of Jesuit and Catholic universities, and they simply said no more money. And with that, the war came to an end because the Salvadoran military were totally dependent on our assistance. In fact, it was the first case since Vietnam where the United States provided more than 50% of the budget of another country. To the present, all abuse begins with the abuse of language. At a press conference earlier this year, President Bush made 22 references to terrorism, although no reporter had asked him one question about terrorism. It's as though the mere invoking of the word justifies every abuse imaginable, from the claim that neither domestic nor international law applies to the prisoners held at Guantanamo base in Cuba, to the sickening outrages against the prisoners at Abu Ghraib. In the fantasy land that high administration officials inhabit, the massive military presence of the United States in Iraq and its small posse of auxiliaries is entitled to the description a coalition. The unilateral American occupation is, quote, a liberation of the Iraqi people, unquote. The selection of the United States, the selection by the United States of a former CIA asset as the Iraqi president becomes a transfer of sovereignty. And those Iraqis who take up arms against an occupying foreign power are terrorists. Now, let us not be under any illusion. Terrorism exists. 9/11 was a classic case of pure terrorism, and we were right to pursue Al-Qaeda and its allies into Afghanistan. But soon we abandoned our focus on Afghanistan and launched a preventive war against Iraq that will surely go down in history as one of the colossal foreign policy blunders of all time. Can human rights survive an age of terror, is the question before the House. Yes, but only if the United States begins to address the root causes of terrorism and stops describing governments that live peaceably with their neighbors, but which have ideological differences with the United States, only if we stop describing these governments as terrorists. For example, Cuba is on the list of terrorist states. absurd, and everyone in the State Department knows it is absurd. Cuba remains on the terrorist list in order to placate the extremists within the Cuban American community in Florida. What better illustration is needed to convince the world that we are not serious about combating terrorism? There is one way to make a start on reducing terrorism and improving relations with the billion or so Muslims around the world. That is to lead the way to a just, fair, and practical solution of the Palestinian trouble. We do neither Israel nor the world any favors by turning over our foreign policy to Ariel Sharon and the Likud party. It was about a half century ago that Reinhold Niebuhr, prominent theologian, predicted that the winner of the Cold War would have such unchallenged authority, such unchecked power, that it could be expected to violate basic standards of justice in the rest of the world. True to Niebuhr's prediction, the United States is today moving away from its status as a republic towards an imperial stance. By our actions yesterday in Central America and today in the Middle East, we put in jeopardy not only human rights, but our republican institutions and the legitimacy of the international order itself. If you think I exaggerate, look at the record of this administration. We cast the only vote against illegal small arms trafficking. We walked out of the London conference designed to strengthen the laws against biological and toxic weapons. We rejected the treaty outlawing landmines, despite the fact that, we don't have any landmines that would violate the treaty. Next we opposed the nuclear test ban treaty of 1996, and we announced that the United States would resume nuclear testing. We have denounced the Kyoto Protocol on greenhouse gas emissions, and President Bush proudly announcing that Kyoto is dead. We have announced our withdrawal from the ABM treaty, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, and we now intend to waste billions and billions and billions of dollars, not intend we are, on trying to develop an anti-ballistic missile. And most recently, we have rejected the International Criminal Court. And not content with rejecting the International Criminal Court, where we in the 40 or so countries around the world where we have troops stationed, we have forced them to sign bilateral mutual immunity accords, thereby forcing countries like Colombia that depend on U.S. troops and traders to violate the International Criminal Court Treaty, which they have always signed. What is certain is that no nation that requires its allies to set aside international treaties, no nation that connives to overthrow other constitutional governments, here I think of Venezuela and Haiti, no nation whose representatives refer to the Geneva Convention as quaint can claim either the standing or the clean hands necessary to judge other countries' human rights performance. steps towards addressing the root causes of terrorism if we have the capacity to tell the nations, to tell ourselves the truth, and if we can start repeating to other nations that you're either with us or against us, then perhaps, just perhaps, we can revive the intellectual and moral energy that radiates from open democratic societies, and perhaps, once again, human rights can become an organizing principle in our foreign policy, that principle and that practice that makes so many other